lecture, we addressed Hume's challenge to the widespread confidence, and it is a confidence that so permeates 18th century European culture that the data and evidence of nature necessitated a logical inference of a benevolent God as the author of that nature. This was, above all, an empirical proposition in the minds of most authors, but there also are two very powerful currents of purely rationalistic analysis of God that reinforced and enhanced such optimistic natural philosophy and theology. One we have encountered already, and that is Matthew Tyndall's analysis of God's being. God, because perfect, lacks nothing. That's what perfect means in philosophical language. Perfect fool doesn't mean that you're a fool and you're perfect, but that you lack not one quality that would be necessary to being a fool, whole, complete. Well, God, because perfect being, lacks nothing. And God created the world not for himself, but for our happiness, from which it follows that everything in the creation, if we understood it correctly, is conducive to the well-being of the creation. The yet more powerful current to such rationalistic analysis is that of the German philosopher Leibniz, whose essays on theodicy being a branch of philosophical theology that deals with the problem of evil. How could there be simultaneously evil in the world and an infinitely good, omnipotent God? Leibniz's theodicy has vast and growing appeal until the mid-18th century. God, being omnipotent, omniscient, and infinitely good, necessarily created, in Leibniz's phrase, quote, the best of all possible worlds, end quote. Think about it logically. We have an infinitely powerful, infinitely wise, infinitely perfect being. He can create any world capable of creation. Any world that does not involve self-contradiction, God could create. So God can create any possible world. What would an infinitely good, infinitely powerful, infinitely wise being do? Create the 2,436th best of all possible worlds? The 88th best of all possible worlds? An infinitely perfect being would create the third best of all possible worlds? No, we knew with logical certainty from an analysis by reason of the nature of God that God created, that God had to create, being God, the best of all possible worlds. So we, who are as far from omniscient, omnipotent, infinitely good as possible, we might look out there and say, oh, I would do this without flies. If I were God, there wouldn't be people. If I were God, oceans wouldn't have tides. There'd be no floods, right? But think of the absurd presumption of such a claim. Universe would be different if I were God. What makes that so absurd, so laughable? God created the universe, and God is an infinitely wise, perfect, good being with infinite power. So what God chose to create, as opposed to your neighbor Joe, what God chose to create, God did with full knowledge of every aspect and every interrelationship that made of this the best of all possible worlds. We might not be able to follow it out because we're finite minds. You love your child. You say to your child, take this medicine, it's good for you. You know the medicine will cure a painful earache, a serious disease. The child takes the medicine, it tastes terrible, but the child takes it. Why? Because the child says, I may not understand this, but my wiser, more powerful parent knows that this bitter taste is part of something larger. My cure knows what is, my parent has a necessary and sufficient reason for what appears to me to be unpleasant. Well, project that upon the universe. Given an infinitely perfect God who has created the best of all possible worlds, the only logical possibility, then whether we understand it or not in each particular case, often we do. Once we understand the importance of bees to agriculture and human life, we're quite glad they have stingers. They make the whole system of agriculture possible. But often we can't follow it out, but reason gives us the satisfying answer. God had a necessary and sufficient reason to put this in the world, which, if we knew what God knew, we would understand that this served a good end. It served the end of the best of all possible worlds. It was an indispensable part of it. Well, things that contribute to something being the best of all possible worlds may be experienced subjectively by us as evil, but objectively they're not evil. They're good. There is no real evil in the creation. Everything contributes to the best of all possible worlds under God's necessary and sufficient reasons. Well, this rationalistic theodicy links with the extraordinarily powerful currents of empirical natural theology to form a deep philosophical and theological optimism. In the words of the English poet Alexander Pope, quote, speaking of the universe, whatever is right. Whatever is right. We have enough knowledge of nature and reason to know and understand that. But David Hume was not alone in opposing the optimistic conclusions of natural theology. And we see this with particular drama in the second thoughts among naturalizing Christian theologians themselves. And most dramatically, in the context of this course, in the case of Bishop Joseph Butler. We encountered Butler in the 1720s precisely as a major influence in naturalizing the Christian view of providence and the goodness of nature. 10 years after his optimistic sermons on the providential design of nature, Butler, who at the time of the sermons is concerned with the gloomy pessimism of Calvin and Hobbes, 10 years later, Butler is aware of deism and of the dangers to Christian religious belief. And now he publishes a celebrated book, a bestseller of the 18th century, with the title, The Analogy of Religion, Natural and Revealed, to the Constitution and Course of Nature. The title sounds optimistic. The title sounds naturalistic. The Analogy of Revealed Religion to the Constitution and Course of Nature. But despite the optimistic sound of the title, Butler's new argument is that the affinity between God's revelation in nature on the one hand and God's supernatural revelation in Scripture on the other, both involved inexplicability. Both involved seeing through a glass darkly. And both required, above all in matters moral, a faith that surpassed human reason and empirical knowledge. Butler in no way has become an anti-rationalist or an anti-empiricist. Indeed, the structure of his argument is empirical data addressed by reason. But what Butler now argues is that the deist central assertion that we have two incompatible claims of revelation by God. One, a scripture that is filled with mystery, things beyond comprehension, things involving inexplicable evil, which we reject because we have, on the other hand, a nature that is wholly lucid, wholly clear, that leads us without ambiguity to recognition of the goodness of God, that is absurd. That in both nature and Scripture, we know enough, we see enough to understand that God is the author of both. There is enough that is sublime in Scripture, and that explains our condition in Scripture. There is enough that is sublime in nature, and that is so beneficent to human beings in nature, and so exquisite in design, that we know God to be the author of both. But against the deist's absurd claim, Butler will argue, the providence of God is seen only darkly in both. Natural religion argued as if everything were clear about God and nature, but both were mysterious enough to require faith to know God affectively. Look at nature, suffering, illness, the prosperity of the wicked, the pains of the good. The providence of God is not clear in nature, even though the structure of nature reveals God as its author, and faith alone reconciles us to divine providence. But no apostasy from philosophical and theological optimism was more dramatic or influential than that of Europe's most celebrated deist, Voltaire. At a time in his life in the 1750s, when Voltaire is in despair over both personal losses, the woman whom he most loved in the world has died, giving birth to the child of another man, and it ends both a personal and an intellectual collaboration that had been the center of his life. When he is in despair over the state of European affairs, which he sees drifting further and further away from ideals of the Enlightenment, and in despair over his own place within that civilization. He had hoped to be the enlightened advisor of kings. He was invited by his admirer Frederick the Great, new Emperor of Prussia, King of Prussia, to come to his court at Potsdam, where Voltaire is humiliated to learn that he is invited there merely as an adornment and not as a major advisor or intellectual figure. And he leaves in great despair, and he has nowhere to go. He is driven out by persecution and clergy wherever he would set himself. He ends up buying an estate that straddles the Swiss-French border, the Geneva-French border. says, when the Protestant clergy come after me, I go to the French part of my estates. When the Catholic clergy come after me, I go to the Protestant parts of my estates. But then, on November 1st, 1755, there is the destructive, catastrophic Lisbon earthquake. The city of Lisbon is in ruins, and tens of thousands lie dead and suffering in that rubble. The Lisbon earthquake, occurring at that moment of despair in Voltaire's life, sears his consciousness, shifts his thinking, and deeply affects thereby the intellectual life of Europe. The earthquake raises very central questions in a system of philosophical and theological naturalistic optimism. How to maintain an optimistic natural theology in the face of such data, how to reconcile the particular evils and pains and suffering of that earthquake and its victims with the providence of God. If the general laws of nature produce such catastrophe, how do we infer and know the providence of God? Voltaire rejects the Leibnizian reply to which he formerly had been drawn. In his own mind, forced to choose between his deistic optimism that denied the existence of real evil, that could look at the mangled, as he himself will put it, at the infants dying at the breasts of mothers crushed under the buildings of Lisbon. Forced to choose between an optimism that would make one stare at that phenomenon and say, this is not really evil. This is ultimately a good in the best of all possible worlds. Or, on the other hand, a cry of anguish over human suffering that said evil is real and inexplicable. Voltaire published a poem on the Lisbon earthquake. In that poem, he argued that all attempted explanations added insult to injury. Could the philosopher stand next to the dying parent who has lost all of his or her children and say, there's a philosophical explanation for this, and this is for the best, in the best of all possible worlds? Evil was real and evil was incomprehensible. Voltaire will write in his preface to the poem, Pierre Bayle was right. Pierre Bayle understood evil is incomprehensible. The notion that God could not prevent earthquakes as part of the system of the world, or human suffering in its untold intensity throughout all of human history, made no sense. God could not be constrained by anything, and yet we suffered. God existed. Voltaire never doubts that for a minute. The world is too complex not to have been designed. But we could not understand providence. And he will write in the poem, it is not God who requires our love and attention. It is suffering humanity. I give my respect to God, he writes. I give my love to human beings. They need hope. They need comfort. Rousseau, who is a fervent deist, will respond in a letter on providence in which he accuses Voltaire of, quote, betraying God's providence, end quote. This is the best of all possible worlds, Rousseau insists. There is a harmony of the physical and moral world. So we must try to understand why earthquakes. If one attempted to build a city underwater, and its inhabitants drowned. You wouldn't blame and rail against the providence of God. You would say, God intended for us to live on land. Well, what causes death and suffering in earthquakes? Cities. The intensity of human concentration in cities. So what is the physical order of the world telling us? That those centers of corruption, that those centers of depravity are not the way we were intended to live. We were intended to live close to nature. Earthquakes are God's way of instructing us through the physical order about what is best in the moral order. Voltaire is horrified by Rousseau's response, and his ordeal becomes greater as Europe plunges into a war begun by Frederick II, Voltaire's own former protege. To read Voltaire's correspondence in the 1750s is to read the correspondence of a tortured man. He will write to his friends that the universe seems on the edge of destruction. Famine is imminent in Europe. Men and women are dying under divine earthquake and human bombardment, and the philosophers declare that this is the best of all possible worlds. He struggles for an answer, and that answer becomes his most enduring work. Unlike any other of his works, for he writes with such ease, it is a work that took him years to write, that goes through draft after draft. He doesn't know how to finish it, and the ending appears to surprise him most of all. But ultimately, his answer to Rousseau and to himself is his most famous and widely read book, Candide, subtitled, or Optimism. If one looks at the drafts of Candide, one sees that Voltaire never knows to whom he is going to give the major voice, the major conclusion. There are so many fits and starts and hesitations. But once he reaches the conclusion of Candide, it is a catharsis. And Voltaire will leave questions of abstract metaphysics and theology and devote himself to the remediable causes of human suffering as he sees them. Candide is filled with wit and humor. Everything Voltaire writes is. But it is an earnest book, a dark book. For beneath the surface of Candide is an attempt to refute an optimistic philosophical system by juxtaposing it in fiction against the human condition. And the choice is metaphysics or humanity. Candide is the student of Pangloss, all word, all verbal, all tongue. He is the student of Pangloss, who is a Leibnizian philosopher whose Leibnizian explanations always appear futile, irrelevant, and absurd in the midst of human pain and suffering, which, whenever he is faced with, Pangloss seeks to explain in terms of how this ultimately all works out for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Philosophical optimism, Voltaire will write in Candide, equals fatalism. A beloved man, Jacques the Anabaptist, all persecuted Christians are heroes in Voltaire's work. Jacques the Anabaptist, a wonderful man, falls overboard trying to save someone who pushes him overboard from a ship in the harbor of Lisbon during the earthquake. Candide is going to jump in to save him, and Pangloss explains, but no, if he drowns, God had a reason. He was meant to drown. All things are for the best in the best of all possible worlds. but such philosophical optimism that for everything there is a divine reason, for nothing really is evil in the best of all possible worlds, Voltaire is showing, leads to fatalism. If whatever is right, then one's actions or attempts to mitigate the suffering around one do not matter. But there is a reality of unredeemed suffering. Voltaire Candide voyages through a world of disease, war, cruelty, natural catastrophe, and endless human suffering. And at the end of the book reaches the conclusion, let us work without theorizing. Pangloss offers a metaphysical explanation of why they have ended as they have ended, to which Candide replies, let us cultivate our garden. The only antidote to pain and despair is to work in the earthly garden, to stave off what suffering and vice we can. God exists, the design of world proves it, but we do not know that he cares for us. Does the king of Egypt, he will write in Candide, care whether a rat is drowning in the hold of one of his ships? The king of Egypt exists, but we do not know our relationship to him. We must work without theorizing, doing what is possible without illusion and without the assurance of success. This conclusion is speaking for much of the philosophical world. And it marks a momentous shift from theological or metaphysical concerns to a redirection of the new philosophy to the human condition. Voltaire represents a transformation of the 18th century itself. For the rest of his life, he will pay abstract theology scant attention, and he will become the crusader par excellence against what he takes to be the remediable causes of human suffering: religious persecution and intolerance, serfdom, the curse of dynastic and mercantilistic war, legal inequality, torture, and above all, what he took to be the religious hatreds and fanaticisms of a Europe that desperately needed to recognize its common humanity and its common vulnerability. From his 60s then, until his death at the age of 88, Voltaire, in his most active and productive period, became the most famous author of his age. And he, more than any other figure, redefined the European intellectual from a speculative philosopher or theologian to a secular member of what Voltaire would term, quote, the party of humanity, end quote. The legacy of this is that in the wake of the crisis of confidence, in system building, in an optimistic natural philosophy and theology in the mid-18th century, Western European intellectuals and culture are transformed in ways that perhaps are permanent. One, we see the displacement of philosophy and the movement of critical minds from philosophy to the causes of suffering in the human condition. Two, we see the legitimacy of refuting formal thought by an appeal to human experience, to the nature of being human. And from this moment on, European and Western readers will look as much to authors of novels, to great literature and drama to understand the human condition and the nature of things as much, far more than they will look to formal philosophers. And finally, one sees in the crisis of deism itself the displacement of theology from the center of intellectual activity. Almost anyone literate can name 5, 10, 20 Enlightenment authors of the 18th century who struggled to improve the human condition. In a room of educated intellectuals, it is hard to find anyone who could name a French Catholic theologian of the 18th century. Something dramatic has happened in European intellectual and cultural life. Thank you very much.